You ever see something so wrong it makes a whole diner go silent?
The diner door exploded open. A barefoot 9-year-old girl stumbled through broken glass, her yellow dress torn and covered in dirt. Blood dripped from her feet as she screamed 3 words that made everyone freeze. "He is coming now." 5 strangers were eating lunch, but when 3 leather-wearing bikers heard WHY, she was running. They didn't just call the police. What they did next exposed a darkness that had been hiding in plain sight for 5 years. This is the true story of how 1 child's courage and 3 unlikely heroes saved 17 lives. The cowbell above Ruby's roadside diner hadn't rung quite like that in 23 years of business. It wasn't the gentle jingle of a customer entering for coffee and pie. No, this sound cut through the lazy afternoon air like a scream itself, sharp, violent, desperate. The door flew open with such force that the bell shattered against the frame, pieces of brass scattering across the worn linoleum floor. And then she appeared. A little girl, no more than 9 years old, barefoot and bleeding, her yellow sundress torn at the shoulder and streaked with dirt that told stories nobody wanted to hear. Her chest heaved with ragged gasps, eyes wide with the kind of terror that ages a face beyond its years. The shadows of whatever she'd escaped still clung to her like a second skin, dark and suffocating. But here, in this moment, she'd found light, or at least, she hoped she had. "Please," the word came out barely above a whisper. Then louder, desperate, raw with the kind of fear that makes grown men's blood run cold. "Please, someone. He's coming." The lunch rush had just ended, leaving behind that peculiar quiet that settles over diners in the dead space between meals. Only 5 souls remained in the roadside sanctuary off Route 66. Rose Marie Thompson, the owner, stood behind the counter wiping down tables with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this exact motion 10,000 times before. 2 truck drivers, Jack Diesel Coleman and Frank Roadrunner Williams, nursed their 3rd cups of coffee in silence. The kind of comfortable quiet shared by men who spend more time with engines than people. And in the corner booth, 3 figures sat that most folks might cross the street to avoid, leather vests marking them as members of the Road Guardians MCA, motorcycle club that valued freedom, loyalty, and a code most people wouldn't understand. Everything stopped. Time seemed to hold its breath. Mason Steele Blackwood, the head of the group, set down his fork with deliberate slowness. His face was weathered by 52 years of sun and road. Lines carved deep around eyes that had seen both the best and worst humanity had to offer. Some called those eyes sharp, others called them haunted. Today, they became something else entirely: focused, calculating, protective. Beside him sat Thomas Bear McGrath, a man built like a refrigerator, with a grey beard that reached his chest. The kind of presence that could intimidate without a single word spoken. The 3rd member, Rafael Shadow Delgado, younger than his companions by a decade, bore scars running down his forearm from a wreck 2 years back. That should be killed him, but didn't. Each man had their own relationship with darkness, their own shadows they'd learned to live with. But the truth they all shared: when innocence cried out, you didn't look away. The little girl's eyes darted between them all: the owner, the truckers, the bikers, searching desperately for something she couldn't quite name. Recognition, maybe, or belief. Then her gaze landed on the 3 leather-clad men in the corner, and something in her expression shifted. Not relief exactly, but a kind of desperate hope that children shouldn't have to feel like she'd been searching for exactly these men, these unlikely guardians, and somehow the road had delivered them to her darkest moment. "Miss," Rose Marie started, her voice gentle as she moved toward the trembling child, motherly instincts overriding the shock. "Are you?" But the girl shook her head violently, her dark hair whipping across her face. No, you don't understand. He's coming right now. Please, I need." Her voice cracked, breaking on the weight of whatever truth she carried. Mason stood slowly, his chair scraping against the linoleum with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. His voice came low, calm, steady, the kind of voice that makes panicked people remember how to breathe again. It carried authority without aggression, strength without threat. "Who's coming, sweetheart?" he asked, and the gentleness in that rough voice would have surprised anyone who didn't know that the hardest men often have the softest hearts for those who need protecting. The girl looked up at him, and in her eyes, Mason saw something that made his jaw tighten. He'd seen that look before, in places he'd tried hard to forget. Combat zones, trafficking routes, places where innocents went to die. This child had seen the face of evil, and evil was hunting her. "Mr. Garrett," she said, and the name came out like poison, like speaking it aloud might summon a demon. "Dr. Vincent Sterling, I mean, the school counselor, he said." Her voice broke again, and tears started streaming down dirt-stained cheeks. "He said nobody would believe me, that I'm just making things up, that I'm troubled." Bear shifted in his seat, and Shadow's fingers, which had been drumming idly against the table, went completely still. The temperature in the room changed, subtle but undeniable. Every person present felt that primal awareness that something very wrong had entered their day, their world, their responsibility. The truth was trying to break through the shadows of lies this child had been forced to carry, and whether they knew it consciously or not, every soul in that diner had just become part of something bigger than lunch and coffee and the endless stretch of highway outside. Rosemarie's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her phone, a gesture Mason caught from the corner of his eye. Good, they'd need authorities, but first, they'd need to keep this child safe until those authorities arrived. The door opened again, and Mason's entire body tensed, ready, but this time it wasn't the predator, not yet. Just the afternoon breeze carrying the scent of asphalt and gasoline, the smells of the road that had been his home for more years than he cared to count. The girl whimpered, pressing herself against the counter, and the sound cut through Mason like a blade. He'd ridden past 1,000 problems in his life, lived by the code that what happened in towns wasn't his business. But some things transcend codes. Some things demand you stand. Consequences be damned. "You're safe here," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Bear and Shadow stood too, flanking him without a word spoken. Brothers who'd ridden together long enough that communication happened in glances and stance. They formed a wall, leather and muscle and unwavering intent. The truckers, Jack and Frank, exchanged a look and rose as well, moving to position themselves near the door. Nobody had given orders. Nobody needed to. When a child runs barefoot and bleeding into your world crying for help, you don't debate philosophy or worry about legal liability. You become the barrier between innocence and whatever darkness chases it. The truth was clear in her eyes, in her terror, in the desperate way she'd chosen them. And the truth, Mason knew, always demands warriors willing to stand in the shadows and fight. Outside, an engine rumbled to a stop. A car door closed with deliberate calm. Footsteps approached, measured and unhurried, the walk of someone confident, someone who believed themselves untouchable. The girl's breathing became rapid, panicked. "That's him," she whispered. "Please, please don't let him take me." Mason met Bear's eyes, then Shadow's. 3 decades of riding together compressed into a single moment of absolute understanding. Whatever happened next, they would not move, they would not yield. They would not let evil walk out that door with innocence in its grasp. No matter the cost, the truth would have its guardians today, and vengeance righteous and necessary would come for those who preyed on the helpless. The shadows were about to discover that some roads led straight to judgment. Mason Steele Blackwood hadn't always been the kind of man who stood between children and monsters. There was a time, decades ago, when he'd been just another young rider chasing freedom on 2 wheels. Running from a past that included a father who drank too much and fists that spoke louder than words. The road had saved him, given him a family when blood had failed him, taught him that strength without purpose was just violence waiting to happen. Now, at 52, with more miles behind him than most people would drive in 3 lifetimes, he understood something that took years to learn. The shadows we carry, define us. How we stand in the light does. His leather vest bore patches from chapters across the country, each one a story, each one a reminder that the Road Guardian's MC wasn't about rebellion for its own sake. It was about protecting what mattered, even when the world didn't understand the language of loyalty spoken in engine rumbles and worn leather. Bertimus McGrath, to anyone foolish enough to use his government name, looked like someone you'd decross the street to avoid on a dark night. 6'4", 280 pounds of muscle that age had softened only slightly, with a grey beard that reached halfway down his chest and hands that could crush a man's windpipe or cradle a wounded bird with equal capability. But those who knew him understood the truth that appearances often hide. The biggest men sometimes carry the gentlest souls, shaped by childhoods where being different meant being a target. where size became either a weapon or a shield. Bear had chosen shield. He'd ridden with Mason for 27 years, through good times and bad, through bar fights and charity runs, through moments when the truth of who they were got tested by a world that judged books by their covers. And in all those years, not once had he turned away from someone in need. Not once had he let the shadows of prejudice dim his light. Shadow Rafael Delgado was the youngest of the three at 42, but he carried scars that aged him in ways calendars couldn't measure. The ones on his forearm from the wreck 2 years back were visible angry lines of pink tissue that told a story of metal and asphalt, and a split-second decision that saved a minivan full of kids at the cost of his own safety. But the deeper scars, the ones nobody saw, came from growing up between two worlds too brown for some, not brown enough for others, finding belonging only on the road, where what mattered was the strength of your word and the loyalty in your heart. He'd learned young that the world dealt in shadows and lies, that people hid truth behind polite smiles and locked doors. That's why he rode with men who dealt in absolutes. You kept your word, you protected the weak, and when darkness showed its face, you didn't flinch. The truth was simple on the road, even when life everywhere else got complicated. Rosemary Thompson had owned Ruby's roadside diner for 23 years, and in that time she'd seen every kind of person the highway could deliver. Families on vacation, salesmen chasing quotas, truckers counting miles until they could go home, and yes, bikers, lots of bikers. She'd learned early not to judge the road guardians by their appearance, learned that Mason always left a $50 tip even when his meal cost $12, that Bear volunteered at the children's hospital in the next county, that Shadow tutored kids in math at the community center every Thursday he was in town. They were good men wearing labels that made others nervous, living proof that truth often hides behind assumptions, that goodness doesn't always arrive in khakis and polo shirts. Today, watching them stand as that terrified child pleaded for help, Rose felt something shift in her chest, pride mixed with fear, hope tangled with dread, because she knew these men would do the right thing, consequences be damned, and in a world that too often looked away, that kind of courage could bring either salvation or ruin. The diner itself had been a sanctuary for travelers since 1972, originally built by Rose's father during the heyday of Route 66. When highways meant freedom and every town along the way offered a different story. The red vinyl booths had been reupholstered twice but still bore the character of decades. The linoleum floor showed patterns of where that mapped the most. Popular paths between counter and tables, and the jukebox in the corner still played Patsy Cline if you hit it just right. This was the kind of place where regulars knew each other as orders and strangers became friends over coffee, where the Wi-Fi was free but conversations were better, where the smell of bacon and fresh pie could make you believe the world was simpler than the news suggested. It had witnessed proposals and breakups, celebrations and grief, the full spectrum of human experience, served alongside eggs and toast. But today, it was becoming something else, a courtroom where truth would battle shadows, where ordinary people would be asked to make extraordinary choices. Lily Grace Harper, though nobody knew her name, yet stood pressed against the counter, her small frame trembling like a leaf in wind, too fierce for something so fragile. Her eyes, dark and impossibly wide, moved between the three bikers with something that looked like desperate recognition, as if she'd been searching for exactly these men without knowing their names or faces. Children possess an instinct adults often lose, an ability to see past surfaces to the core of people, to sense who will protect and who will harm. She'd run into this diner, not randomly, but with purpose, drawn by some primal understanding that leather and steel sometimes house the most reliable hearts. The truth she carried was too heavy for her small shoulders, the shadows of what she'd escaped, too dark for one child to face alone. But looking at Mason, Bear, and Shadow, she felt something she hadn't felt since her parents left for Seattle. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. Mason saw the recognition in her eyes and understood it instantly. The road had a way of connecting souls across impossible distances, of putting people exactly where they needed to be at precisely the right moment. Some called it fate, some called it God. Mason just called it the road providing, the same force that had brought him to this diner on this day when this child needed guardians. He'd seen that look before in combat zones overseas, during his stint in the Marines, in women fleeing bad situations at truck stops, in animals that had been hurt but still hoped for kindness. It was the look of someone who'd lost faith in the world, but was willing to try one more time, to reach out one more hand and pray it didn't get slapped away. The truth was written in her posture, her terror, her desperate hope. And the shadows chasing her were about to discover that some lines you didn't cross, some innocence you didn't touch, not while men like Mason Steele Blackwood still drew breath. The door opened with careful control, not the violent crash of Lily's entrance, but the measured pace of someone who believed himself in complete command of the situation. Dr. Vincent Sterling stepped inside Ruby's roadside diner like a man walking into his own living room, his movements smooth and unhurried. Mason's eyes tracked every detail with the precision of someone who learned long ago that survival meant reading people faster than they could lie to you. Sterling wore khaki slacks with a perfect crease, a powder blue polo shirt that screamed respectability, and leather loafers without a scuff mark. His salt and pepper hair was styled with the kind of attention that took 15 minutes every morning, and a gold wedding band caught the afternoon light filtering through the diner windows. Everything about him said trust me, which was exactly why every instinct Mason possessed started screaming the opposite. There you are, Emma, Sterling said, and the relief in his voice was so perfectly calibrated it could have won awards. He pressed one hand to his chest, the universal gesture of a worried guardian reunited with a lost child. Sweetheart, you had me so worried. Mason watched Lily's reaction, the way her entire body went rigid, the way she pressed herself harder against the counter like she was trying to disappear into it, the way her breathing accelerated into something close to hyperventilation. That wasn't confusion. That wasn't a child having an episode. That was pure, primal terror, the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you're re-looking at and what they're capable of. No, she whispered, shaking her head so violently her hair whipped across her face. No, no, no. Bear shifted his weight beside Mason, and the movement was subtle but deliberate, a mountain, adjusting its foundation. Shadow's hand, which had been resting casually on the table, moved to his belt, not reaching for a weapon, but repositioning into readiness. Sterling's eyes swept the diner with practiced efficiency, cataloging each person in milliseconds before his gaze settled on Rosemarie. The smile never wavered, warm, apologetic, the expression of a good man dealing with a difficult situation. I'm so sorry for the disturbance, he said, his tone perfectly pitched between concern and embarrassment. My daughter gets confused sometimes. She has episodes. The word hung in the air like poison disguised as medicine. Mason had heard that word before, seen how people used clinical language to dismiss inconvenient truths, to make victims sound unreliable before they could even speak. Rose's hand hesitated on the phone she'd been reaching for, uncertainty clouding her features. That's what men like Sterling counted on, that moment of doubt, that pause where good people second-guessed their instincts because they'd been trained to trust authority and credentials over their own eyes. Is that right? Mason's voice cut through the moment, low and level, carrying the kind of authority that had nothing to do with titles or polo shirts. Sterling turned to face him, and Mason caught the microscopic adjustment in his expression, the way his smile tightened just a fraction before expanding into something even warmer. The man extended his hand, and Mason noted the manicured nails, the absence of calluses, the softness of someone who'd never worked with their hands. Richard Garrett, he said, then caught himself with a small laugh that sounded almost genuine. Sorry, Vincent Sterling. Dr. Vincent Sterling. Long day, you know how it is. I'm a counselor at Oakwood Elementary. Emma's been under my care at the school. Mason didn't shake the offered hand. Neither did Bear. Neither did Shadow. The silence stretched, and Sterling's arm stayed extended just long enough to make the rejection clear before he withdrew it, the smile never quite reaching his eyes. She has some behavioral issues, he continued, addressing the room as if explaining to reasonable adults. Poor thing. Runs off when she gets overwhelmed. We've been working on coping strategies, but he trailed off with a shake of his head that said everything he wanted people to believe without saying it out loud. He's lying. Lily's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the tension-thick silence it carried like a shout. Mason kept his eyes on Sterling, watching for the tell. There was always a flicker of anger, a tightening of the jaw, a shift in posture. Sterling's came in the brief hardening of his gaze before the mask reassembled itself. Emma, please, he said, and now there was a note of weary patience in his voice, the sound of an adult dealing with a difficult child in public. We've talked about this. Making up stories doesn't help anyone. Rose took half a step forward, her motherly instincts warring with trained deference to authority. Sir, maybe we should. But Lily interrupted, her voice stronger now, riding some current of desperate courage. "Call Principal Anderson. She knows me. She knows I don't lie. My name is Lily, not Emma. Lily Grace Harper." Mason filed that a waist-hurling had called her Emma, either. He truly didn't know the child's name, or he'd slipped, confused her with someone else. Neither option was good. Sterling laughed, and Mason caught the hollow note underneath it, the sound of performance rather than genuine emotion. Of course, he said smoothly. "Though the school day ended hours ago, I'm sure Principal Anderson has gone home by now. She has grandchildren she helps with after school." He took a step forward, movements still controlled and non-threatening, hands visible and open. "Come on, sweetheart. Your parents are worried sick." This was the moment. Mason realized the pivot point, where Sterling expected compliance, where most people would defer to the well-dressed professional with the perfect story. "My parents are in Seattle," Lily said, and her voice carried a steadiness now that made Mason proud of a child he'd met 5 minutes ago. "At my grandma's funeral. That's why you picked today." Because nobody was watching. The air in the diner changed. Not dramatically, there was no thunder, no sudden wind, but the quality of silence shifted into something heavier, more dangerous. Jack Coleman, one of the truckers, set down his coffee cup with deliberate care and stood. Frank Williams followed suit. "Picked today for what?" Mason asked, his tone conversational but his posture anything but. Sterling's smile tightened into something that barely qualified as an expression anymore. "Look, I appreciate your concern, but this is a family matter." "I'm not his family," Lily interrupted, her small voice carrying absolute certainty. "I'm not anyone's family right now. That's the whole point." She looked directly at Mason, and in her eyes he saw a determination that had survived whatever hell she'd been through. "He's been watching me all year. Since my parents started working late, he offers to drive kids home. Takes the ones nobody's watching." Her voice cracked but didn't break. "He took Sophia Chen 3 weeks ago. She didn't come back to school. Everyone said she moved, but she didn't. I saw her backpack in his car." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Mason had interrogated men in combat zones, had looked into the eyes of people who'd done unspeakable things. He knew how to read the moment when a mask slipped, when the person underneath the performance forgot to maintain character. Sterling's eyes went cold for exactly 1 second, calculating, measuring distances to the door, odds of success. Then the warmth snapped back into place like a switch being flipped. "This is ridiculous," Sterling said, and now there was an edge in his voice, steel underneath velvet. "Emma Lilior, getting yourself into serious trouble with these accusations. I'm a respected educator. I've worked with troubled children for 15 years. Shadow stood, his chair scraping against linoleum. He didn't say anything, just moved to position himself between Sterling and the door, not blocking it, not yet, just present. Bear rose too, and his sheer size made the space feel smaller, made Sterling have to crane his neck slightly to maintain eye contact. "Seems like the kid's pretty specific for someone who's just confused," Bear rumbled, his voice like gravel rolling down a mountainside. Sterling's jaw tightened, and Mason saw the muscles in his neck tense. "I don't appreciate what you're insinuating. I could have you all arrested for harassment." The threat hung there, and Mason knew it was meant to remind them that he had the weight of respectability, that they were just bikers in leather vests, that society would believe him over them. Mason stood slowly, his movement drawing Sterling's attention like a magnet. "Then you won't mind us calling that principal," he said, his voice calm as still water before a storm. "What was the name?" "Anderson." He glanced at Rose. "Betty, you got your phone?" Rose nodded, already pulling it from her apron pocket, and Mason caught the slight tremor in her hands. But they were moving, dialing, and that was what mattered. "What's the school's name, honey?" Rose asked, her voice gentle despite the tension. "Oakwood Elementary," Lily said quickly. "Please hurry." Sterling's composure cracked further, like ice under pressure. "This is harassment. I could have you all arrested for interfering with the guardian's rights." Cruz spoke for the first time since Sterling had entered, his voice carrying a slight accent that reminded people he'd learned English as a second language, that he knew what it was like to be dismissed and underestimated. "Guardian," he said, letting the word hang. "Thought you said you were a counselor. Those are different things." "No." Mason watched Sterling's face cycle through calculated expressions: concern, patience, wounded dignity, one precisely calibrated for maximum effect. The man was good at this, had probably practiced these reactions in mirrors until they became second nature. But Mason had interrogated enemy combatants in places where lying meant survival, and he'd learned to spot the microscopic tells that separated genuine emotion from performance. Sterling's pupils dilated slightly when Lily mentioned Sophia Chen. His breathing pattern changed for exactly 2 seconds before he consciously regulated it. His right hand moved toward his pocket before stopping, redirecting to adjust his collar instead. Small things, invisible to most people. But Mason collected small things the way other people collected stamps. And right now those small things were spelling out a story Sterling didn't want told. "Look," Sterling said, and his voice carried the weary patience of someone dealing with unreasonable people. "I understand you're concerned. That's admirable, really. But you have to understand I've worked with troubled children for 15 years. I have credentials from the state board, recommendations from 3 superintendents, and a spotless record." He gestured vaguely toward himself, as if his appearance and credentials were self-evident proof of innocence. "This young lady has been struggling since her parents started working longer hours. Separation anxiety, acting out for attention. We've documented everything with the school psychologist." The words came smooth as oil, designed to plant doubt, to make everyone in the diner question their own instincts. Mason had to admit it was masterful, the way Sterling positioned himself as the voice of reason, the trained professional dealing with amateur good intentions. 15 years, Bear repeated slowly, his voice like distant thunder. "That's a long time to build trust, long time to learn who to target." Sterling's jaw tightened fractionally. "I don't appreciate what you're insinuating." "Ain't insinuating nothing," Bear replied. "Just observing that predators usually don't wear signs." The word hung in the air, predator, and Mason saw Sterling's mask slip again for just an instant. The eyes went flat and cold, calculating odds and distances. Then the performance resumed, but Mason had seen what lived underneath, and it confirmed every instinct screaming in his gut. This man was dangerous. This man had done exactly what Lily was accusing him of. And this man believed he was untouchable because he'd built a fortress of respectability around himself. Rose's voice cut through the tension, slightly trembling but determined. "I have Principal Anderson on the line." Sterling turned to her, and Mason caught the flash of genuine concern that crossed his features before being smoothed away. "That's really not necessary. I can show you my school ID. She says she filed a missing child report this morning," Rose continued, her hand covering the phone's receiver. "When Lily didn't show up for school and they couldn't reach her parents." The silence that followed was different than before, heavier, more dangerous. Jack Coleman and Frank Williams moved closer to the door without being asked. 2 men who'd spent enough years on the road to recognize when a situation was about to turn. Shadow shifted his stance, and Mason knew without looking that his brother was positioning for a physical confrontation if needed. "That can't be right," Sterling said, but the smooth confidence had developed hairline cracks. "I checked on her house myself." Nobody answered. "I assumed." "You assumed what?" Mason's voice cut like a blade. "That nobody was watching. That you could take your time." Lily's voice rose from where she stood, pressed against the counter, stronger now, fed by the validation of adults finally listening. "He was waiting outside my house this morning, in his car. When I ran out the back door, he followed me. I've been hiding all day. I waited until I saw your motorcycles in the parking lot before I came inside." Mason felt something shift in his chest. This child had been running and hiding for hours, had seen their bikes, and somehow known they would help. The road provided in mysterious ways, connected souls across impossible distances. Sterling laughed, but it sounded hollow now, desperate. "This is absurd. You're going to believe a troubled child over a respected educator. I sit on the school board. I've received community service awards. I coach youth soccer on weekends." He was throwing credentials like shields, each one designed to protect him from accountability. Mason had seen it before, how institutions protected their own, how titles and positions became armor against accusations, how people couldn't reconcile the monster with the man who smiled at PTA meetings. "My parents are flying back right now," Lily said, her voice gaining strength with each word spoken and believed. "Detective Anderson said they got emergency notification. They'll tell you I don't lie. They'll tell you Sophia's family were our neighbors until they moved away 3 weeks ago right after she disappeared." Sterling's composure was fracturing visibly now. His hand moved toward his pocket again, and this time Mason moved faster. Not aggressive, just present. Just a subtle shift that put him between Sterling and the door, between Sterling and Lily. "Let's keep our hands where everyone can see them," Mason said quietly. The temperature in the diner had shifted completely. What had started as uncertainty had crystallized into collective understanding. Every person in that space, Rose, the truckers, the bikers, had reached the same conclusion through different paths. This well-dressed man with his perfect credentials and practiced expressions was exactly what Lily said he was, and they were going to stop him from walking out that door. Consequences be damned. Sterling looked around at the circle tightening imperceptibly around him, and for the first time, genuine fear flickered across his features. Not the fear of an innocent man wrongly accused, but the fear of a predator realizing the trap had closed. "You people have no idea what you're doing," he said, and the mask was gone now, leaving something colder underneath. "No legal authority, no right to detain me. This is kidnapping, assault. I'll sue every single one of you." Shadow smiled, and it wasn't friendly. "Funny thing about doing the right thing," he said softly. "Sometimes it costs everything. Still worth it." Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer with each passing second, but nothing in 23 years behind that counter had prepared her for this moment. Holding her phone with Principal Margaret Anderson's voice coming through the speaker, each word landing like a hammer blow. "I need you to repeat that," Rose said, though she'd heard perfectly well the first time. Her hand trembled slightly, and she pressed the phone harder against her ear, as if that would change what was being said. Mason watched her face drain of color, watched her free hand grip the counter edge until her knuckles went white. Whatever Anderson was telling her, it was bad. "Since when?" Rose asked, her voice barely steady. A pause while she listened, and Mason could hear the faint sound of the principal's voice through the receiver, urgent, worried, official. "I see. Yes, I'll hold." Rose covered the phone and looked directly at Lily, and in her eyes was something Mason recognized immediately, the specific horror of realizing a child had been telling the truth about something unspeakable. "What did she say?" Lily whispered, and in that small voice was both hope and terror, the desperate need to be believed, warring with the fear of what belief would confirm. Rose's voice came out gentle despite the tremor running through it. "Principal Anderson filed a missing child report this morning. When you didn't show up for school and they couldn't reach your parents, they called the emergency contact." She paused, and her eyes flickered to Sterling. "The counselor, Dr. Sterling, said he'd drive by your house to check on you." The room went dead silent. Mason felt at that moment when everyone's individual suspicions crystallized into collective certainty, when doubt evaporated and truth stood naked in the middle of a roadside diner. Sterling's expression transformed in a way that would have been invisible to someone not watching for it. The practiced warmth didn't just fade, it evaporated, leaving something fundamentally different underneath, colder, harder, calculating, with the precision of someone who'd been caught before and talked his way out. Or maybe someone who'd never been caught at all and was measuring whether he still could. "This is a misunderstanding," Sterling said, but the smooth confidence had curdled into something sharper. "I did check her house. She wasn't there. I reported back to the school." His eyes darted between the bikers and the door, and Mason saw him doing math: distance, obstacles, odds of making it to his car. Bear shifted his massive frame, not threatening, but unmistakably blocking. The man didn't need to be aggressive. His sheer presence was enough to make people recalculate their options. "Funny how your story keeps changing," Bear rumbled. "First she's your daughter, then she's confused, then she's a troubled student you're helping. Now you're just checking on her house." Sterling's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching near his ear. "I misspoke under stress. You people are surrounding me, intimidating me. This is illegal detention." Shadow laughed without humor. "Keep talking about legal. Pretty sure when the cops get here, they're gonna have questions about why a missing kid ran away from you, specifically." The sirens were closer now, close enough that individual vehicles could be distinguished, multiple units, converging from different directions. Rose spoke into the phone again, her voice steadier now. "Principal Anderson, the police need to know Lily is here and she's safe. But the man who came looking for her," she glanced at Sterling, "I think you should tell them to hurry." Mason could hear Anderson's voice rising in pitch, urgent questions firing through the line. Rose answered quickly, giving the diner's address, describing the situation with the clinical precision of someone forcing herself to stay calm. "Yes, multiple witnesses. No, she's not hurt, but she's terrified of him. Yes, He's still here. Sterling's composure cracked further, and Mason saw the moment when calculation shifted to desperation. "You people have no idea what you're doing," he said, and his voice had changed completely, the warmth gone, replaced by cold fury barely contained. "You think this matters? Think one little girl's word against mine means anything?" The mask was off now, and what showed underneath made Mason's hands curl into fists. He'd seen that expression before in the eyes of men who considered other people as objects, who believed their position and power made them untouchable. "I'm a pillar of this community," Sterling continued, his voice rising. "I counsel children. I sit on the school board. I have letters of recommendation from senators, and you—" He looked at the bikers with open contempt. "You're nobody. Criminals, probably. You think anyone's going to believe you over me?" The words hung in the air like poison, and Mason felt bare tense beside him. But before anyone could respond, Lily's voice cut through, small but absolutely clear. "I can prove it," she said. Every eye in the diner turned to her. She stood straighter now, no longer pressed against the counter, something fierce burning in her expression that made her look older than 9 years old. "He has a storage unit. Number 17 at the Sunset Storage Facility by the highway. I saw the key fall out of his pocket during art class last week. It had the number on it, 17. I memorized it because—" her voice wavered but didn't break, "because Sophia Chen was my best friend. Because her backpack disappeared from school the same day she did. Because I saw that same backpack in his car 3 days later when he offered me a ride home, and I said no." The confession hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Mason watched Sterling's face, saw the exact moment when the man realized his carefully constructed fortress had a crack, and that crack was about to bring the whole structure down. "Storage Unit 17, Rose repeated into the phone, her voice carrying across the diner. "Principal Anderson, did you get that? The police need to check Storage Unit 17 at Sunset Storage Facility." Sterling moved, then a sudden lunge toward the door. That caught everyone by surprise for exactly half a second. He was fast, Mason would give him that. Probably thought his respectable appearance and clean record would let him talk his way out once he made it outside, once there was distance and time to craft another story. But he'd miscalculated 2 things. First, that the truckers weren't just observers. Jack Coleman stuck his leg out with the timing of someone who'd been in more than a few roadhouse brawls, and Sterling went down hard, his expensive loafers finding no purchase on the worn linoleum. Second, that Bear's reflexes were still sharp despite his size and age. Sterling hit the floor with a grunt, air knocked from his lungs, and before he could recover, Bear's knee was in his back, and his arms were being pulled behind him with professional efficiency. "Stay down," Bear said quietly, and there was no anger in his voice, just absolute certainty. Sterling thrashed, shouting about assault and lawyers and rights, but his words dissolved into the wail of sirens pulling into the parking lot. Mason moved to Lily, putting himself between her and the struggling man on the floor. "You did good, kid," he said quietly. "Real good." Lily looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much, but still held hope, and nodded once. Outside, car doors slammed and heavy boots hit pavement, Justice arriving in uniform, finally ready to listen to what a child had been trying to say all along. The first officer through the door was young, maybe 25, with the kind of crisp uniform and careful movements that marked someone still proving themselves. His hand rested on his holster, not drawing but ready, his eyes scanning the diner and landing on the scene with visible confusion. A large bearded man kneeling on a well-dressed civilian, 3 leather-vested bikers standing in a loose semicircle, a small girl pressed against the counter, 2 truckers blocking the exit, and Rosemary Thompson holding a phone like it was the most important object in the world. "Police," the officer announced, unnecessarily. "Someone want to tell me what's happening here." Mason raised his hands slowly, palms out, the universal gesture of non-aggression. He'd dealt with law enforcement enough times to know that the first 30 seconds determined everything, whether you were seen as helpful, witness, or potential threat. "Officer, the child there Lily Harper ran in here scared about an hour ago. This man followed her, claiming to be her guardian. Principal Anderson at Oakwood Elementary can confirm Lily was reported missing this morning, and that this man Dr. Vincent Sterling was the last person who said he'd check on her." Mason's voice stayed level, factual, giving the officer something concrete to work with. 3 more officers entered, including a woman with sergeant stripes, who took in the scene with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd seen enough domestic disturbances to read a room quickly. "He tried to take me," Lily said, her voice small but clear. The sergeant's expression shifted, and Mason caught the moment when training kicked in, when a domestic disturbance became something potentially much darker. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stop struggling," she said to Sterling, her voice carrying authority without aggression. "Can someone explain why this man is on the floor?" Bear spoke up, his rumbling voice surprisingly calm. "He tried to run when the principal confirmed the girl was reported missing. I stopped him from leaving before you arrived. Didn't hurt him, just kept him here so you could sort this out." The sergeant's eyes narrowed slightly, assessing whether that was citizen assistance or illegal detention. Mason could see her working through the calculations. "He has a storage unit," Lily said suddenly, urgently. "Number 17 at Sunset Storage. He keeps things there, Sophia's backpack. Please, you have to check." "She might." Her voice cracked, and Rose moved closer, one protective hand on the girl's shoulder. The sergeant pulled out her radio. "Dispatch, this is Sergeant Chen. I need backup at Ruby's Roadside Diner, Route 66. Also need units sent to Sunset Storage Facility. Possible evidence in a missing child case. I need a detective and child services out here immediately." Sterling, still pinned under Bear's knee, finally stopped struggling. "This is assault," he said, his voice tight with restrained fury. "I'm a school counselor. These men attacked me. I want them arrested." The sergeant looked at him, then at the terrified child, then at Rose still holding the phone. "Ma'am, is Principal Anderson still on the line?" Rose nodded and handed over the phone. The sergeant took it, stepping a few feet away, and Mason watched her expression change as she listened, jaw tightening, eyes going cold in that particular way law enforcement officers get when something triggers their protective instincts. She asked several short questions, listened to long answers, then handed the phone back to Rose. "Officer Bryant," she said to the young cop, "take statements from everyone here. Nobody leaves. Thompson, help him up, but keep him in custody." The young officer moved forward, and Bear rose smoothly, allowing Thompson to pull Sterling to his feet. The man's expensive polo shirt was rumpled now, dirt smudged across one shoulder, his carefully styled hair disheveled. The mask of respectability had cracked, and what showed through looked smaller, meaner. "I'm Detective Catherine Reynolds," a new voice announced from the doorway. A woman in her 40s entered, wearing a blazer over jeans, badge clipped to her belt. Her face was weathered in the way that comes from years of seeing humanity's worst, but her eyes were sharp and kind simultaneously. She looked at Lily first, ignoring everyone else, and her expression softened fractionally. "Lily Harper." The girl nodded, and Reynolds crouched down to be at eye level. "I'm Kate. I work with kids who've been through scary things. You're safe now, okay? Nobody's going to hurt you while I'm here." Lily nodded again, and some of the tension in her small frame eased. Reynolds straightened and turned to the sergeant. "Status: missing child report filed this morning. Subject claims to be school counselor. Offered to check on child. Child ran from him and came here. Multiple witnesses state he pursued her. Tried to leave when principal confirmed the missing person report. Child alleges he's responsible for another missing child, Sophia Chen, disappeared 3 weeks ago. Child claims subject has storage unit that may contain evidence." Reynolds' expression hardened. "Sophia Chen," she repeated quietly, and Mason caught recognition in her voice. This wasn't a new name to her. She turned to Sterling, and her gaze was clinical, assessing. "Dr. Sterling, we've met before, haven't we? At the school safety assembly last month." Sterling straightened, trying to resurrect some dignity. "Detective Reynolds, yes, which is why this is so absurd. These people have assaulted me based on the fantasies of a troubled child. And get him in a car. I want him separated from the child." As Thompson moved forward with handcuffs, Sterling's composure finally shattered completely. "You're making a mistake. I have lawyers. I have connections. You're going to regret this." Reynolds stepped closer to him, her voice dropping low enough that Mason had to strain to hear. "I've been working Sophia Chen's disappearance for 3 weeks. Her parents are destroyed. If you have anything to do with that, if that storage unit has what I think it has, you're going to wish assault was all you were facing." Sterling's face went pale. and for the first time, genuine fear showed in his eyes, not the fear of embarrassment or inconvenience, but the fear of someone realizing the walls were closing in. Mason watched them lead Sterling out, the man's expensive shoes scuffing against the floor, his protests growing fainter as the door closed behind him. The diner felt different, now like a storm had passed through, leaving everything slightly rearranged. Reynolds turned to the group. "I'm going to need detailed statements from all of you. This is going to be a long afternoon." She looked at Mason, Bear, and Shadow specifically. "You three did something today that could go either way legally. You physically detained a man. Could be heroic, could be problematic." Mason met her gaze steadily. "We kept a scared child safe until people who could help arrived. Whatever comes of that, I'll handle it." Reynolds studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I think you will." Detective Reynolds drove like someone who'd spent years navigating emergencies, fast but controlled, using lights and sirens only when necessary. Mason rode in the passenger seat of her unmarked sedan at her request, partly as witness and partly because she'd seen something in his eyes that told her he needed to see this through. Bear and Shadow followed on their bikes, engines rumbling behind them like rolling thunder. The sun was starting its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if Mason's mind was consumed with what they might find in Storage Unit 17. Lily's face kept appearing in his memory, the desperate hope when she'd given them that number, the terrible certainty in her voice when she'd said Sophia's name. "You former military?" Reynolds asked, breaking the tense silence. Mason glanced at her, surprised by the question. "Marines. 2 tours overseas. Long time ago." She nodded, eyes on the road. "Thought so. The way you handled yourself back there, de-escalating, but ready. Most civilians panic or overreact. You did neither." Mason didn't respond immediately, watching the highway mile markers flash past. Some things you don't forget. Reading situations, knowing when someone's lying, understanding that sometimes doing the right thing means getting your hands dirty. Reynolds made a sound that might have been agreement. "That man back there, Sterling, he's been on my radar since Sophia Chen disappeared. Perfect record, spotless reputation. Everyone loved him, but something felt off. The way he inserted himself into the investigation, offering to help, asking too many questions about what we'd found." "You suspected him," Mason said. "It wasn't a question. Suspected, yes. Could prove, no. Without evidence, he was untouchable. And then today, a 9-year-old girl does what an entire police department couldn't. She connects the dots." Reynolds' hands tightened on the steering wheel. "If she's right about that storage unit." She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. They both knew what they might find. Best case, evidence. Worst case, Sophia Chen's body. Mason pushed that thought away, focused instead on Lily's certainty. The kid had been specific about the backpack, about seeing the key. Children that age didn't fabricate details like that, didn't maintain consistent stories under pressure if they were lying. Whatever was in Unit 17, it would prove Lily had been telling the truth from the beginning. Sunset Storage Facility appeared ahead, a sprawling complex of orange-painted units stretching across several acres, surrounded by chain-link fencing and security cameras that probably recorded everything and nothing simultaneously. 2 patrol cars were already there, officers securing the perimeter. Reynolds pulled up to the gate and badged her way through, and Mason felt his pulse quicken. This was the moment, the pivot point, where Lily's courage either saved lives or confirmed worst fears. They parked near Building C, and Mason climbed out, joined immediately by Bear and Shadow. The 3 of them stood together without speaking, united by something deeper than words. They'd stood in the diner together. Now they'd see this through together. That's what brothers did. "Unit 17 is around back," an officer called out, and they followed Reynolds through the maze of storage units. The facility felt eerie in the dying light shadows lengthening between buildings, the smell of hot metal and dust hanging in the air. Mason's military training kicked in automatically, scanning for threats, noting exits and sightlines. They rounded a corner, and there it was, Unit 17. A standard 10 by 10 with a rolling metal door and a heavy padlock. Reynolds held up the bolt cutters they'd brought. "Once we open this, whatever's inside becomes evidence. Everyone understand?" Mason nodded along with the others. She positioned the cutters, and the lock snapped with a metallic crack that seemed too loud in the quiet evening. Reynolds rolled the door up slowly, and Mason's breath caught. The unit wasn't empty. Boxes lined the walls, carefully labeled, meticulously organized. A folding table held a laptop and what looked like files, and in the corner, visible even in the dim light filtering in, a child's backpack decorated with cartoon characters. Reynolds pulled out her flashlight and swept it across the space, and Mason heard her sharp intake of breath. "We need the full forensics team here now," she said into her radio, her voice tight. "And an ambulance. Tell them to hurry." Mason's heart lurched. "Is she?" But Reynolds was already moving deeper into the unit, and Mason saw what she'd seen: a sleeping bag in the far corner, and a small figure curled inside it. "Sophia," Reynolds called out gently, kneeling. "Sophia Chen, your parents are looking for you. You're safe now." The figure stirred, and Mason felt something in his chest crack open. Alive. The girl was alive. Sophia emerged slowly from the sleeping bag, small, thin, with dark hair matted and eyes that blinked against the light, like someone emerging from a cave. She was dehydrated, clearly traumatized, but breathing and conscious. Reynolds wrapped her jacket around the girl's shoulders, speaking softly, reassuringly, while radioing for the ambulance to move faster. Mason stepped back, giving them space, and felt Bear's massive hand on his shoulder. Neither of them spoke. There weren't words for this moment, the terrible collision of horror and relief. The knowledge that they'd found her, but understanding what she must have endured. "There's more." An officer called from near the boxes, and Reynolds carefully left Sophia with a female officer who'd arrived, moving to investigate. Mason watched as she opened one box, then another, her expression growing darker with each discovery. Files, photographs, documentation that spoke of planning and pattern. "How many?" Mason asked quietly. Reynolds looked up, and her eyes held something Mason recognized from war zones, the look of someone who'd discerned evil and would carry it forever. 17 victims documented here, some dating back 5 years. Different schools, different towns. He moved around, stayed ahead of investigations. She pulled out a file, and Mason saw a child's school photo paper-clipped to medical records, notes written in precise handwriting. He documented everything, like he was proud of it. Bear made a sound low in his throat, not quite a growl, but close. Shadow turned away, jaw clenched tight. Mason forced himself to breathe, to stay present. This was why Lily had run. This was what she'd been trying to stop. And because she'd been brave enough to speak, because she'd run into a diner and trusted 3 strangers. Sophia Chen was being wrapped in a thermal blanket and given water instead of becoming another statistic. The ambulance arrived, lights painting the storage facility in alternating red and white. Paramedics moved with practiced efficiency, loading Sophia onto a stretcher, while Reynolds coordinated the crime scene response. Mason watched it all unfold with a strange sense of detachment, the organized chaos of justice finally catching up with evil. "Her parents have been notified," Reynolds said, returning to where the 3 bikers stood. "They're meeting the ambulance at the hospital. She's going to need a lot of help recovering from this." She paused, then looked at Mason directly. "You know what this means? What Lily did today?" Mason nodded slowly. "She saved 17 kids from being forgotten, gave families answers they'd been praying for." Reynolds smiled, but it was sad around the edges. "She did more than that. She trusted you 3 when she could have trusted no one, when the world had given her every reason to believe adults wouldn't listen. That matters." Bear shifted beside Mason. "Kids got more courage than most soldiers I served with." The sun was setting properly now, the sky deepening to purple and gold. Crime scene techs were arriving in waves, setting up lights and barriers, beginning the careful process of documenting everything in Unit 17. Mason knew they'd be here for hours, maybe days, cataloging evidence that would put Sterling away for life. But for now, in this moment, standing outside a storage unit where nightmares had been stored alongside innocent faces, Mason felt something settle in his chest. They'd stood when they could have walked away. They'd believed when they could have doubted. And because of that, Sophia Chen was breathing free air for the first time in 3 weeks. "Let's go check on Lily," Mason said quietly. "She deserves to know her friend's alive." Detective Reynolds drove like someone who'd spent years navigating emergencies fast but controlled, using lights and sirens only when necessary. Mason rode in the passenger seat of her unmarked sedan at her request. partly as witness, and partly because she'd seen something in his eyes that told her he needed to see this through. Bear and Shadow followed on their bikes, engines rumbling behind them like rolling thunder. The sun was starting its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. That would have been beautiful if Mason's mind was in consumed with what they might find in storage unit 17. Lily's face kept appearing in his memory, the desperate hope when she'd given them that number, the terrible certainty in her voice when she'd said Sophia's name. "You former military?" Reynolds asked, breaking the tense silence. Mason glanced at her, surprised by the question. "Marines, 2 tours overseas. Long time ago." She nodded, eyes on the road. "Thought so. The way you handled yourself back there, de-escalating, but ready. Most civilians panic or overreact. You did neither." Mason didn't respond immediately, watching the highway mile markers flash past. Some things you don't forget. Reading situations, knowing when someone's lying, understanding that sometimes doing the right thing means getting your hands dirty. Reynolds made a sound that might have been agreement. "That man back there, Sterling, he's been on my radar since Sophia Chen disappeared. Perfect record, spotless reputation. Everyone loved him, but something felt off. The way he inserted himself into the investigation, offering to help, asking too many questions about what we'd found." "You suspected him," Mason said. It wasn't a question. Suspected, yes, could prove no. Without evidence, he was untouchable. And then today, a 9-year-old girl does what an entire police department couldn't. She connects the dots. Reynolds's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "If she's right about that storage unit." She didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. They both knew what they might find. Best case evidence, worst case, Sophia Chen's body. Mason pushed that thought away, focused instead on Lily's certainty. The kid had been specific about the backpack, about seeing the key. Children that age didn't fabricate details like that, didn't maintain consistent stories under pressure if they were lying. Whatever was in Unit 17, it would prove Lily had been telling the truth from the beginning. Sunset Storage Facility appeared ahead, a sprawling complex of orange-painted units stretching across several acres, surrounded by chain-link fencing and security cameras that probably recorded everything and nothing simultaneously. 2 patrol cars were already there, officers securing the perimeter. Reynolds pulled up to the gate and badged her way through, and Mason felt his pulse quicken. This was the moment, the pivot point, where Lily's courage either saved lives or confirmed worst fears. They parked near Building C, and Mason climbed out, joined immediately by Bear and Shadow. The 3 of them stood together without speaking, united by something deeper than words. They'd stood in the diner together. Now they'd see this through together. That's what brothers did. "Unit 17 is around back," an officer called out, and they followed Reynolds through the maze of storage units. The facility felt eerie in the dying light, shadows lengthening between buildings. The smell of hot metal and dust hanging in the air. Mason's military training kicked in automatically, scanning for threats, noting exits and sightlines. They rounded a corner, and there it was, Unit 17, a standard 10 by 10 with a rolling metal door and a heavy padlock. Reynolds held up the bolt cutters they'd brought. "Once we open this, whatever's inside becomes evidence. Everyone understand?" Mason nodded along with the others. She positioned the cutters, and the lock snapped with a metallic crack that seemed too loud in the quiet evening. Reynolds rolled the door up slowly, and Mason's breath caught. The unit wasn't empty. Boxes lined the walls, carefully labeled, meticulously organized. A folding table held a laptop and what looked like files, and in the corner, visible even in the dim light filtering in, a child's backpack decorated with cartoon characters. Reynolds pulled out her flashlight and swept it across the space, and Mason heard her sharp intake of breath. "We need the full forensics team here now," she said into her radio, her voice tight. "And an ambulance. Tell them to hurry." Mason's heart lurched. "Is she?" But Reynolds was already moving deeper into the unit, and Mason saw what she'd seen, a sleeping bag in the far corner, and a small figure curled inside it. Sophia. Reynolds called out gently, kneeling. "Sophia Chen, your parents are looking for you. You're safe now." The figure stirred, and Mason felt something in his chest crack open. Alive. The girl was alive. Sophia emerged slowly from the sleeping bags, more thin, with dark hair matted, and eyes that blinked against the light, like someone emerging from a cave. She was dehydrated, clearly traumatized. but breathing and conscious. Reynolds wrapped her jacket around the girl's shoulders, speaking softly, reassuringly, while radioing for the ambulance to move faster. Mason stepped back, giving them space, and felt Bear's massive hand on his shoulder. Neither of them spoke. There weren't words for this moment, the terrible collision of horror and relief, the knowledge that they'd found her but understanding what she must have endured. "There's more," an officer called from near the boxes, and Reynolds carefully left Sophia with a female officer who'd arrived, moving to investigate. Mason watched as she opened one box, then another, her expression growing darker with each discovery. Files, photographs, documentation that spoke of planning and pattern. "How many?" Mason asked quietly. Reynolds looked up, and her eyes held something Mason recognized from war zones, the look of someone who'd seen evil and would carry it forever. 17 victims documented here, some dating back 5 years, different schools, different towns. He moved around, stayed ahead of investigations. She pulled out a file, and Mason saw a child's school photo paper, page 2 medical records, notes written in precise handwriting. He documented everything, like he was proud of it. Bear made a sound low in his throat, not quite a growl, but close. Shadow turned away, jaw clenched tight. Mason forced himself to breathe, to stay present. This was why Lily had run. This was what she'd been trying to stop. And because she'd been brave enough to speak, because she'd run into a diner and trusted 3 strangers, Sophia Chen was being wrapped in a thermal blanket and given water instead of becoming another statistic. The ambulance arrived, lights painting the storage facility in alternating red and white. Paramedics moved with practiced efficiency, loading Sophia onto a stretcher while Reynolds coordinated the crime scene response. Mason watched it all unfold with a strange sense of detachment, the organized chaos of justice finally catching up with evil. "Her parents have been notified," Reynolds said, returning to where the 3 bikers stood. "They're meeting the ambulance at the hospital. She's going to need a lot of help recovering from this." She paused, then looked at Mason directly. "You know what this means? What Lily did today?" Mason nodded slowly. "She saved 17 kids from being forgotten, gave families answers they'd been praying for." Reynolds smiled, but it was sad around the edges. "She did more than that. She trusted you 3 when she could have trusted no one, when the world had given her every reason to believe adults wouldn't listen. That matters." Bear shifted beside Mason. "Kids got more courage than most soldiers I served with." The sun was setting properly now, the sky deepening to purple and gold. Crime scene techs were arriving in waves, setting up lights and barriers, beginning the careful process of documenting everything in Unit 17. Mason knew they'd be here for hours, maybe days, cataloging evidence that would put Sterling away for life. But for now, in this moment, standing outside a storage unit where nightmares had been stored alongside innocent faces, Mason felt something settle in his chest. They'd stood when they could have walked away. They'd believed when they could have doubted. And because of that, Sophia Chen was breathing free air for the first time in 3 weeks. "Let's go check on Lily," Mason said quietly. "She deserves to know her friend's alive." The drive back to Ruby's diner felt different than the journey to the storage facility lighter somehow. Despite the weight of what they'd witnessed, Mason rode his bike this time, Bear and Shadow flanking him, engines harmonizing in that particular rhythm only riders understood. Detective Reynolds led the convoy in her sedan, emergency lights creating a strobing pattern against the darkening sky. Mason's mind kept replaying the moment Sophia had emerged from that sleeping bag alive, breathing, saved, because one 9-year-old girl had been brave enough to speak truth when the world wanted her silent. That image would stay with him forever, he knew, joining the collection of moments that defined why the road had called him in the first place. Ruby's diner blazed with lights when they arrived. More patrol cars parked outside now, news vans setting up in the lot. Word had spread fast: missing child found alive, school counselor arrested, bikers somehow involved. Mason dismounted, and immediately felt the weight of cameras turning toward them. He ignored the reporters shouting questions, focused instead on the diner's entrance where he could see Lily through the window, sitting at the counter with a blanket around her shoulders and a social worker beside her. Rosemary was pouring her hot chocolate, and the normalcy of that gesture, caring for a child with warm drinks and kindness, made something tighten in Mason's chest. This was what protection looked like, not just stopping threats, but creating spaces where innocence could breathe again. Lily Reynolds called gently as they entered, and the girl's head snapped up. Her eyes found Mason first, then moved to Reynolds, searching for answers to the question she was too afraid to ask aloud. Reynolds crouched beside her, and her voice carried only warmth. "Sophia's alive. She's on her way to the hospital right now, dehydrated and scared, but alive. Because of you." The change in Lily's expression was instantaneous, terror and hope colliding into something that looked like relief, so profound it was almost painful to witness. "She's really alive." The words came out barely above a whisper. "She's really okay." Mason nodded. "She's really alive. They found her exactly where you said. You saved her life, kid." Lily's face crumpled, and tears came, not the terrified tears from earlier, but something cleaner, releasing months of fear and guilt and responsibility no child should carry. The social worker pulled her close, and Rose appeared with tissues, and for several minutes the diner held space for a child to finally, safely, fall apart. Mason stayed back, giving her room, but caught her eyes once over the social worker's shoulder. She mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." He nodded once, feeling the weight of those words settle somewhere deep. Outside, gravel crunched under tires, multiple vehicles arriving simultaneously. Through the window, Mason saw a man and woman practically fall out of a rental car, their faces painted with desperate hope and terror in equal measure. Her parents, Reynolds confirmed quietly. The diner door flew open, and Jennifer Harper burst through with the kind of energy only parents of missing children possess, wild, desperate, barely contained. "Lily, Lily." Her voice cracked on her daughter's name. Michael Harper was right behind her, his face streaked with tears he hadn't bothered wiping away. Lily turned, saw them, and launched herself off the stool. The reunion happened in the center of Ruby's roadside diner. 3 people colliding into an embrace, so tight it looked like they were trying to merge into one being. Jennifer collapsed to her knees, pulling Lily down with her, hands running over her daughter's face, and arms like she needed physical confirmation this was real. Michael wrapped around both of them, his shoulders shaking with sobs he'd probably been holding since the phone call that said their daughter was missing. "We're so sorry," Jennifer kept repeating. "We're so sorry, baby. We should never have left. We should have." But Lily shook her head against her mother's shoulder. "You couldn't know. Nobody could know. He was so careful." Michael looked up then, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate, scanning the diner until they landed on Mason, Bear, and Shadow standing quietly near the counter. Rose must have told him something, or maybe it was just instinct, but he knew. He carefully extracted himself from his wife and daughter, crossed the space between them, and extended a trembling hand to Mason. "You saved her." His voice broke completely. "God help me, you saved my little girl." Mason shook his hand, feeling the man's grip tighten to the point of pain. "Your daughter saved herself," he said firmly. "She's the bravest person I've met in a long time. We just stood in the way until people who could actually help arrived." But Michael was shaking his head, tears streaming freely now. "You didn't have to. You could have looked away. Most people would have." Bear shifted beside Mason. "Couldn't do that. Not to a kid." Jennifer had joined them now, still holding Lily's hand like she'd never let go again. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't have words for what you did. You saw her when she needed someone to see her." Detective Reynolds stepped forward, her professional demeanor softening slightly. "Mr. and Mrs. Harper, I know this is overwhelming, but I need to get Lily's full statement, and you should know the evidence we found tonight connects Sterling to 17 victims over 5 years. Your daughter didn't just save herself, she saved other families from going through what you've experienced today." The weight of that settled over the diner like snow, quiet, profound, transformative. Jennifer pulled Lily closer, and Michael's expression cycled through shock, gratitude, and something that looked like awe as he looked at his daughter. 17, he repeated quietly. Lily looked small in her mother's arms, but somehow larger than before, aged by circumstances but strengthened by them too. "Sophia was my best friend," she said simply. "I couldn't let her be gone forever." The next hour passed in organized chaos, statements given, social workers consulting, news crews being managed, coffee consumed in industrial quantities. Mason, Bear, and Shadow stayed because Reynolds asked them to, but mostly because leaving felt wrong somehow. They'd started this with Lily. They needed to see it through. As the evening deepened into night, Reynolds pulled the 3 bikers aside. "Sterling's lawyer is already making noise about illegal detention and assault," she said bluntly. He's going to argue you three had no authority to hold him. Mason met her eyes steadily. Will it stick? Reynolds smiled grimly. Not a chance. Between the security footage, 6 witness statements, and the mountain of evidence in that storage unit, Sterling's going away for life. But I wanted you to know it's coming. Appreciate the warning, Shadow said. Worth it either way. Reynolds studied them for a long moment. You know what you three did today? You gave 17 families their lives back. Some of those kids have been missing for years. Parents who thought they'd never have answers are going to get closure. That's not nothing. Bear rumbled his agreement. Just did what needed doing. Outside, the last news van was packing up, the initial frenzy fading into the longer story that would unfold over weeks and months. Mason glanced at his watch. Nearly midnight. They'd been in this diner for over 8 hours, but it felt both longer and shorter simultaneously. Time worked differently when lives hung in balance. We should head out, Mason said finally. The three of them moved toward the door, but Lily called out from where she sat between her parents. Wait. She ran over, something clutched in her small hand, a napkin with crayon drawing. 3 motorcycles, 3 riders, and 1 small figure standing between them, and a shadowy form. Above it, in careful child's handwriting, heroes. Mason took it carefully, like it was made of glass. You keep being brave, Lily. World needs more people like you. She smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and nodded. Will I see you again? The question hung there, hopeful and innocent. Mason smiled back. Roads long, kid. Crosses paths more than you'd think. He carefully folded the napkin drawing and tucked it into his vest pocket, right over his heart. 3 weeks after that day at Ruby's diner, Mason sat in the same corner booth, nursing coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The diner looked the same: red vinyl, worn linoleum. Patsy Cline still playing if you hit the jukebox, right? But something fundamental had shifted. Rose Marie had framed a newspaper clipping behind the register. Local bikers help rescue missing children. The headline felt surreal every time Mason saw it, like reading about someone else's life. Bear slid into the booth across from him, dropping a manila envelope on the table. Detective Reynolds dropped this off. Said you'd want to see it. Mason opened it carefully, knowing before he looked what it would contain. Updates. The investigation had sprawled beyond anyone's initial expectations. The first document detailed Sterling's arrest, record charges multiplying daily as forensic teams processed evidence from Storage Unit 17. Child endangerment, kidnapping, assault, and darker charges Mason didn't want to think about too closely. The prosecution was building a case that would ensure Sterling never saw freedom again. 17 victims documented, but Reynolds suspected more children whose families had moved away, whose disappearances hadn't been connected because Sterling changed schools every few years, staying ahead of patterns. They found his planning notebooks, Bear said quietly. Detailed notes on which kids had absent parents, who walked home alone, which families wouldn't be believed if they complained. He'd been doing this for over a decade. Mason set the paper down, his jaw tight. Some evils were so methodical they stopped feeling human. Shadow arrived, sliding in beside Bear with a tablet. "You've seen the news?" He turned the screen toward them, showing a segment from the local station. Sophia Chen's parents being interviewed, their daughter beside them, thinner than her school photos but smiling cautiously. "She's been brave through all of this," Mrs. Chen was saying. "The therapy is helping." And knowing that her friend Lily never stopped believing she was alive, that's giving her strength to heal. The interviewer asked about the bikers, and Mr. Chen's expression shifted to something Mason couldn't quite read. They did what the system failed to do. They listened to a child when adults with credentials told them not to. "I don't care what they look like or what people assume about motorcycle clubs. They saved my daughter's life." The segment cut to other families' parents of children whose cases had been cold for years, suddenly getting answers they'd prayed for but stopped expecting. A mother in Pittsburgh whose son had been missing for 3 years. A father in Ohio whose daughter disappeared on her way home from school. All connected through Sterling's documentation, his meticulous record-keeping becoming the evidence that would free them from years of not knowing. 17 families, Shadow said softly. 17 sets of parents who can finally breathe again. Mason watched the screen, feeling the weight of that number. They hadn't saved 17 children that day Lily had, but they'd been present when presence mattered, had stood when standing was required. Rose appeared with fresh coffee, topping off their cups without asking. "You three are local celebrities now. she said, not quite teasing. Had 4 different reporters in here yesterday asking about you. Bear made a face. Hope you told them nothing. Rose smiled. Told them you ordered eggs and bacon, paid your bill, and treated people with respect. That's all anyone needs to know. She paused, her expression softening. Lily's parents came by last week. Left something for you. She pulled an envelope from her apron, and Mason recognized Lily's handwriting on the front. He opened it carefully while Bear and Shadow leaned in to read. The letter was written in purple crayon on lined paper, the kind you get in elementary school. Dear Mason, Bear, and Shadow, it read. I wanted to tell you what happened after you left. Sophia came home from the hospital after 5 days. She's still scared sometimes, but she's getting better. The police found 12 other kids because of what was in that storage unit. Some of them were missing for years. Their families called my house to say thank you. My mom says I was brave, but I don't feel brave. I feel like I was just scared and ran to the right place. My teacher says sometimes being brave means doing the right thing even when you're terrified. I guess that's what you taught me. Thank you for believing me when the scary man said nobody would. Love, Lily. P.S. My dog Harley says hi. I named her after motorcycles because they mean safety now. Mason read it twice, then carefully folded it and tucked it beside the napkin drawing in his vest. Bear cleared his throat roughly, eyes suspiciously bright. Shadow looked away, jaw working. 3 men who'd seen combat and tragedy and darkness, undone by purple crayon and a child's gratitude. She named her dog after motorcycles, Bear said finally, and his voice was thick. Kids, something special. Mason nodded, unable to trust his own voice. Detective Reynolds arrived just then. Her appearance so perfectly timed, Mason wondered if Rose had called her. She slid into the booth beside Mason, looking tired but satisfied in a way that suggested long nights finally paying off. Thought you'd want an update, she said without preamble. Sterling's lawyer tried to argue illegal detention and assault. Judge threw it out in about 15 minutes. The security footage was pretty clear. You 3 never touched him until he tried to run. And when Bear stopped him, it was textbook citizen's arrest. She pulled out her own folder, spreading photos across the table. These are the kids we've identified so far. 17 confirmed, but we're tracking leads on 6 more. Every single family has been notified. Every single child is either home or we know what happened. She tapped one photo, Sophia Chen smiling in her school picture. This one's alive because of what happened in this diner. 3 others we found alive too, placed in facilities under false names. Sterling was careful, methodical, but ultimately his documentation is what's destroying him. Mason studied the faces children of different ages, different backgrounds, united only by having crossed paths with a predator. What about Lily? Shadow asked. How's she handling all this? Reynolds smiled, genuine warmth breaking through her professional demeanor. She's incredible. Been doing therapy twice a week, but her therapist says she's processing it remarkably well. Having Sophia back helps. They've been inseparable, and her parents aren't letting her out of their sight, obviously. She paused, then looked directly at Mason. She talks about you 3 constantly. You became her proof that adults could be trusted, that strength didn't have to be threatening. That's a gift most kids don't get, especially after trauma. The weight of that settled over the table like snow. Mason hadn't thought about their role beyond the immediate keep the child safe, hold the predator, let justice happen. But Reynolds was right. They'd shown Lily something she needed to see. The district attorney wants to give you 3 commendations, Reynolds continued. Public ceremony, medals, whole thing. Bear shook his head immediately. Pass, Shadow agreed. We don't need recognition. We need kids to be safe. Mason met Reynolds' eyes. We did what anyone should have done. Don't make us symbols. Reynolds studied them for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but you should know the department's implementing new protocols because of this. Training on how to assess child testimony, how to recognize grooming patterns, how to investigate respected community members without bias. Your actions that day exposed failures in the system. We're fixing them. That felt more meaningful than any metal systemic change that might protect children these 3 would never meet. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the diner windows gold. Mason watched the light shift and change, thinking about roads and choices, and the strange way lives intersected at precise moments. They'd been in this diner by chance, or maybe not chance at all. Maybe the road really did provide, connected souls across impossible distances. put people exactly where they needed to be. Lily had needed guardians. They'd been there. Sophia and 16 others had needed someone to believe, to act, to stand against evil wearing a respectable mask. Lily had been that someone, and they'd supported her when support mattered most. "You heading out?" Reynolds asked. Mason nodded. "Road's calling. Always does eventually." She extended her hand. "Thank you. For what it's worth, you restored my faith that day. In people, in justice, in the idea that doing right still matters." 6 months had passed since that afternoon at Ruby's diner, and Mason found himself back on Route 66, but this time as a guest rather than a traveler passing through. The community center in the small town had transformed into something special, banners hanging from rafters, tables covered in white cloths, families filling every available seat. Today was Lily Harper's recognition ceremony, and somehow Mason, Bear, and Shadow had been convinced to attend, despite their preference for staying out of spotlights. Rosemarie had called personally, her voice carrying that particular tone that made refusing impossible. "The kids specifically asked for you three," she'd said. "Says it won't mean anything if her heroes aren't there." The ceremony began with Principal Margaret Anderson taking the podium, her voice steady but emotional. "What we witnessed 6 months ago redefined courage for this community," she said. Looking directly at Lily sitting in the front row between her parents, a 9-year-old child saw patterns adults missed, spoke truth when lies were more comfortable, and trusted her instincts when the world told her she was wrong. Because of Lily Harper's bravery, 17 families have their children back. Because she refused to stay silent, a predator who operated in shadows for over a decade now faces justice. The applause was thunderous, but Mason watched Lily's face. She looked uncomfortable with the attention, small in her chair despite the enormous things she'd accomplished. Sophia Chen's parents approached the microphone next, Sophia standing between them looking healthier than the last time Mason had seen her on the news. Mrs. Chen's voice wavered as she spoke. "My daughter was missing for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of not knowing if she was alive, if she was suffering, if we'd ever see her again." Lily never stopped believing Sophia was out there. She risked everything to speak up when staying silent would have been safer, Mr. Chen added. And 3 strangers in a diner chose to believe a child over a respected professional. They chose truth over convenience, protection over comfort. That decision saved not just our daughter, but 16 other children. Mason felt Bear shift uncomfortably beside him, neither of them accustomed to being praised for doing what felt like basic human decency. The ceremony continued with testimonials from other families' parents whose children had been recovered from facilities across 3 states, all connected through Sterling's meticulous documentation. Each story added weight to the moment, transforming what could have been simple recognition into something profound. Detective Reynolds spoke about the systemic changes implemented since that day: new protocols for investigating child testimony, mandatory training on recognizing grooming patterns, interagency cooperation that might prevent future predators from moving between jurisdictions undetected. Lily didn't just save 17 children, Reynolds said firmly. She exposed failures in systems designed to protect them. "We're better now because she was brave then." When Lily finally stood to receive her award, the Principal's Medal for Courage, the entire room rose with her. Mason watched her walk to the stage, still small but somehow larger than before. Aged by circumstances, but strengthened to. She accepted the medal, looked at it for a long moment, then spoke into the microphone without notes or preparation. "I was really scared that day," she said, her young voice carrying clearly. "I thought nobody would believe me because Dr. Sterling was important and I was just a kid. But then I saw 3 motorcycles in the parking lot, and something told me those were the right people to run to." Her eyes found Mason's across the crowded room. "They didn't know me. They could have ignored me. But they stood up when standing up was hard. That's real courage." The afternoon dissolved into celebration, families mingling, children playing, food shared in that particular way communities do when something worth celebrating finally arrives. Mason stood near the punch table watching it all unfold, feeling both present and separate, like observing something he was part of but didn't quite belong in. Jennifer Harper approached with Lily, who was clutching her medal and a leash attached to a golden retriever puppy. "This is Harley," Lily announced proudly. "She's named after motorcycles because they mean safety now." The innocence of that statement, that engines and leather had become symbols of protection rather than threat, made something tightened in Mason's chest. "We're moving," Michael Harper said, joining them. New city, fresh start. Lily's therapist thinks it'll help with the healing process. He extended his hand to Mason. But we wanted to see you three before we left. Wanted Lily to say goodbye properly. Mason shook his hand, understanding what wasn't being said, that this chapter was closing for the Harper family, that they needed distance from memories too painful to carry daily. You take care of yourself, kid, Mason said to Lily. Keep being brave, keep speaking up when things feel wrong. The world needs people like you. Lily hugged him suddenly, fiercely, her small arms barely reaching around his waist. Thank you for teaching me that big and scary doesn't mean bad, she whispered. That sometimes the people who look different are the safest ones. As the sun began setting and families started leaving, Mason, Bear, and Shadow walked toward their motorcycles parked in a row. Rosemarie caught them before they could mount up. You three changed this town, she said simply. Changed how people think about judging books by covers, about listening to children, about what heroism actually looks like. Shadow smiled slightly. We just did what needed doing. Rose nodded, understanding that for men like them, extraordinary actions felt ordinary when measured against personal codes that demanded nothing less. The engines roared to life in sequence, and Mason felt the familiar rumble beneath him. Home and purpose combined. They pulled onto the highway as twilight painted the sky purple and gold. 3 riders, moving toward horizons unknown, carrying with them the knowledge that courage came in all sizes, and sometimes the smallest voices carried the most important messages. 2 years after Ruby's diner, Mason was 500 miles north in Montana when the envelope caught up with him. The road guardians had a mail forwarding system, packages and letters, shuffling between clubhouses until they found their intended recipients. This one was addressed in handwriting he recognized immediately, despite not having seen it in 24 months. Lily Harper. The postmark showed a town in Oregon, confirming the family had made their fresh start far from painful memories. Mason sat on his bike in a rest stop parking lot, mountain peaks visible in every direction, and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph and a letter. The photo showed Lily older now, 11 maybe, with Harley grown from puppy to full-size dog beside her. But what caught Mason's attention was what Lily was wearing, a small leather vest decorated with patches, and she was sitting on a bicycle painted to look like a motorcycle. She was grinning, genuine and unforced, the kind of smile that belonged to a kid who survived darkness and found light on the other side. Mason smiled despite himself, then unfolded the letter written in neater handwriting than the crayon note from years ago. Dear Mason, Bear, and Shadow, it began. I'm 11 now, 6th grade. I joined the school safety committee and helped teach younger kids about trusting their instincts when something feels wrong. My counselor says I'm turning my trauma into purpose, which sounds fancy but really just means I don't want what happened to me to happen to anyone else. Sophia is doing great too. We're still best friends, even though we live in different states now. We video chat every week, and she is thinking about becoming a police officer when she grows up. I want to be a counselor, the good kind, not the kind that hurts people. Mason read slowly, savoring each sentence, feeling pride for a child he'd known for only a few hours, but who left a permanent mark on his understanding of courage. The letter continued. Mum and Dad are better now. They were really scared for a long time after everything happened, but therapy helped them too. We have family dinners every night, and they ask me about my day and actually listen. It's nice. Detective Reynolds came to visit us last year. She said Dr. Sterling got sentenced to life in prison without parole. All 17 families testified. She said our case changed how police investigate child testimony across the whole state. That feels big. Bear appeared then, having stopped when he noticed Mason pulled over. He read over Mason's shoulder, his massive frame casting shadow across the paper. Kids doing good, he rumbled approvingly. Shadow joined them moments later, and the 3 stood in comfortable silence as Shadow read the final paragraphs. I wanted to tell you something important, Lily had written. For a long time after everything happened, I had nightmares, not about Dr. Sterling exactly, but about that moment when I ran into the diner, not knowing if anyone would help. In my dreams, the diner was empty, or people looked away, or nobody believed me. Those dreams were worse than the real memories. But then I'd remember your faces, how you stood up immediately, how you didn't hesitate or question whether I was worth the trouble, how you made me feel like I mattered when I'd been told I didn't. And those memories were stronger than the nightmares. You taught me something that changed everything. That scary and dangerous aren't the same thing. That sometimes the people society tells you to fear are the ones who'll protect you most fiercely. That real strength means standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves. Mason felt Bear's hand on his shoulder, a brief squeeze that communicated what words couldn't. I'm learning to ride a real motorcycle. The letter continued, and Mason could practically hear the excitement in her words. Mum almost had a heart attack when I asked, but Dad convinced her. He said, I've earned the right to face my fears on my terms. I have a learner's permit and everything. My instructor says I'm a natural. Maybe someday I'll ride Route 66 and stop at Ruby's Diner. Rose Marie sends me postcards sometimes. She says the booth where you sat has a small plaque now. It doesn't have your name, she said. You wouldn't want that, but it says, reserved for heroes. People know what it means. The letter concluded simply, thank you for being exactly where I needed you to be. Thank you for teaching me that courage about not being scared about doing the right thing anyway. Thank you for believing a 9-year-old girl when the world told you not to. I carry that with me every single day. You saved my life, but more than that, you taught me what kind of person I want to be. Love, always. Lily Harper. P.S. Harley is 85 pounds now and thinks she's still a lapdog. Some things don't change. Mason carefully refolded the letter and tucked it beside the napkin drawing and the first purple crayon note in his Vesta collection. Of proof that moments mattered, that choices echoed across years, that standing up when it cost something created ripples that spread farther than you could measure. Kid's gonna be something special, Shadow said quietly. Bear nodded. Already is. They mounted their bikes without further discussion, engines rumbling to life in perfect harmony. The road stretched ahead, endless, unknown, full of possibility. Somewhere out there, a girl was learning to ride. Somewhere, families were whole again because truth had won against shadows. And somewhere on Route 66, a booth sat reserved for 3 men who'd proven that heroes came in unexpected packages. 5 years, 5 full rotations around the sun since a barefoot girl ran into Ruby's Diner and changed everything. Mason Steele Blackwood sat on his motorcycle at a rest stop overlooking the Pacific Ocean, watching waves crash against rocks below, and thought about how time moved differently on the road. Days blurred into weeks, miles accumulated into thousands, but certain moments remained crystalline, perfect and unchanging, no matter how much distance you put between yourself and them. That afternoon at the diner was one of those moments. It lived in his memory with the clarity of yesterday, playing on repeat whenever he questioned whether the road still had purpose beyond the simple act of moving forward. The leather vest he wore carried new patches now, chapters visited, brothers lost, causes supported but tucked inside the inner pocket, protected from weather and wear, remained 3 pieces of paper, a napkin drawing in crayon showing 3 motorcycles and 1 small figure, a letter in purple ink thanking him for believing when belief was scarce, and most recently, a photograph that had arrived last month, showing a young woman in graduation robes standing beside a motorcycle, not a bicycle painted to look like one, but a real Harley-Davidson Sportster in deep blue. Lily Harper at 16, having just received her full motorcycle license, along with her high school diploma. The note attached simply said, "The road called." I answered, "Thank you for showing me the way." Bear pulled up beside him, followed shortly by Shadow. The 3 of them sat in silence watching the ocean, engines cooling, minds wandering along familiar paths. They'd ridden together for over 30 years now, accumulated enough stories to fill libraries, witnessed humanity at its best and worst. But that single afternoon, that convergence of need and presence, of a child's courage and men willing to stand, had become their measuring stick for what mattered. Every decision since then got filtered through one question. What would we have wanted someone to do if that was our kid? The answer shaped everything from which charities they supported to how they responded when they saw injustice unfolding in parking lots and rest stops along endless highways. "You see the news last week?" Chateau asked, breaking the comfortable quiet. Mason nodded. Sterling had died in prison, natural causes, heart attack, no foul play suspected. 17 families notified. Closure of a different kind, settling over lives that had been disrupted by his evil. Detective Reynolds had called personally to tell Mason, her voice carrying satisfaction tempered by the knowledge that justice delayed was still justice denied for too many years. Worlds better without him in it, Bear rumbled, and neither of the others disagreed. Some truths were simple, even when everything else got complicated. Rosemary had called too, updating them on the diner. The booth with the small plaque remained reserved most days, but she let travelers sit there who seemed to need reminding that goodness existed in unexpected places. The story had become local legend, how 3 bikers had protected a child and exposed a predator, how courage came in all sizes, how judging books by covers cost lives. Schools brought field trips to the diner now, teachers using it as a tangible example of standing up when standing up was hard. Rose said she'd lost count of how many kids had asked if they could meet the motorcycle heroes. Mason always said no. Heroes were people who did extraordinary things. They'd just done what anyone should do: believe children, protect innocence, stand against evil regardless of cost. But the ripples kept spreading in ways none of them could control. The Road Guardians MC had seen membership requests triple after the story went national. Young people wanting to ride with men who represented something beyond rebellion, who proved that strength could serve rather than dominate. The club had become more selective, understanding that every new member now carried responsibility for a reputation built on one afternoon of doing right. They'd started a foundation, small, quiet, funding programs that taught children to trust their instincts and adults to believe child testimony. Lily had helped design the curriculum, her experience transformed into education that might prevent future predators from operating in shadows. Mason pulled out his phone, a concession to modern times he'd resisted for years, and scrolled through messages. Parents thanking them for giving hope. Teachers sharing how they used the story to discuss bystander intervention. Survivors of abuse saying the story helped them understand that speaking up mattered even when it was terrifying. And kids, dozens of kids, sending pictures of themselves on bicycles and motorcycles, wearing leather vests decorated with patches, proclaiming courage, truth, protection. The next generation learning early that size and appearance meant nothing compared to character and action. That the scariest looking person might be your safest choice. That truth always, eventually, defeated shadows. "You think we made a difference?" Shadow asked, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. Mason considered the question, really considered it, weighing 5 years of evidence against a lifetime of skepticism about whether individual actions mattered in a world so vast and complicated. Then he thought about Sophia Chen, alive and pursuing her dream of becoming a police officer. About 16 other children returned to families because Lily spoke and they listened. About Lily herself, riding a Harley and teaching others to trust themselves. About schools implementing new protocols and police departments training differently, and parents having conversations about listening to their children's fears. "Yeah," Mason said finally. "Yeah, I think we did." The 3 of them sat watching waves crash and reform. Endless cycle of destruction and creation. Nature's reminder that nothing stayed the same, but patterns persisted. They'd been part of a pattern that day, an ancient one, really. Guardians protecting innocence, truth confronting lies, light exposing shadows. They'd played their part without script or rehearsal, improvising justice when systems failed. And somehow, impossibly, it had been enough. The engines roared back to life as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. Time to ride, time to move forward, time to be present for whatever the road delivered next, because that was the code. You showed up, you stood up, you spoke up when silence cost lives. This story isn't just about 3 bikers and 1 brave girl. It's about every moment you've either witnessed something wrong and had to choose speak up or stay silent. It's about the children in your community who might be crying for help in ways you haven't learned to hear. It's about understanding that heroes don't wear capes or badges. Sometimes they wear leather vests. Sometimes they're 9 years old and barefoot. Sometimes they're you when the moment demands it. So here's what I need you to do right now. If this story moved you, don't let that feeling fade when you scroll to the next video. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that courage comes in unexpected packages. Leave a comment telling us about a time you spoke up when staying silent would have been easier, because your story might give someone else the strength they need. And if you believe that truth must always defeat shadows, that protecting the innocent matters more than protecting comfort, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because stories like Lily's happen every single day. Predators still operate in plain sight. Children still struggle to be heard. And people who could help still walk past because they don't want to get involved. The question isn't whether you'll encounter a moment like this. The question is, when that moment comes, will you be ready to stand? Don't let Lily's courage be just another story you watched once. Let it be the thing that changes how you see the world, how you respond to instinct, how you choose between comfort and what's right. Hit that subscribe button, share this video, comment with your story, and most importantly, pay attention to the children around you. Believe them when they speak. Stand up when standing up is hard. Because truth always wins against shadows, but only when enough people are willing to shine light into darkness. What will you do the next time courage calls?